Assalamu alaikum. We're going to read on Haji Sulaiman Shah Muhammad, this part 16. A contemporary of Dr. Abdullah Abdurrahman was Haji Sulaiman Shah Muhammad. He was less successful in establishing a recognized school for the advancement of education among Muslims, a community, but as a public spirited immigrant from India 1883, he proved to be a talented and rich businessman. He dreamed of establishing a Muslim school in Cape Town. He wrote a book uh, entitled A Tour Round the World, which depicts his travels with a purpose to learn about peoples through Western Asia, Europe, um, Australia, India, China, Japan, and North America. Uh, he was influenced by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, the founder of the Aligarh Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College. Shah Muhammad bought Lot 3 and 4 in Claremont, present Steegman Road Mosque, for the purpose of a post-fifth grade and after matriculation academy that would be accessible to all. That was against the South African law and customary segregation between coloreds and whites at the time. His vision included an institute that would function as a college where students can obtain academic degrees, annexed to Haji Shah Muhammad's will in 1925. While Dr. Abdurrahman settled for only a primary school with Arabic, Haji Shah Muhammad envisaged the teaching and learning of Arabic and Islamic philosophy. On the 29th of June 1911, the first foundation stone was laid for the new Muslim school at Claremont. The South African News, 29th June 1911. Haji Shah Muhammad intended to help the mass of disenfranchised communities of the Cape who was excluded from higher education. Very good point. No, non-whites were not allowed to go to university by law. The Haji believed that the West benefited from the East and had progressed and now should contribute to the advancement of the East in cultural terms. He believed that it can be done by advancing Eastern higher education. He did not reach out to the whites for funding. Uh, that I think that point is made because Dr. Abdurrahman did ask whites to actually contribute. He invite them to his house, etc., and get white philanthropists to actually contribute to the establishment uh, of Rahmania Primary School for funding. But he approached Zanzibar. That's in the Garden of 1915, Mohammedanism in South Africa. The academy could not get off the ground because there were no high schools for colored children at the time. The mosque was eventually built, but the academy never really came into existence, even up till today. The property is still there, but nothing has been established. The academy were the paternalism of other problems that prevented the establishment of the academy were the paternalism of the Haji. The broader community could not identify with the vision and ideals of the Haji. Few of the poor might have qualified to enter the academy. There was general poverty in the community, and they were not able to afford university fees. The Haji appointed non-Muslims as co-administrators, the mayor of Cape Town and the Cape Civil Commissioner of the Trust of the Academy, as well as the Fori Kramat monument to the grave of Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar. So that was not acceptable in the Muslim community. Okay, leading figures of the then Muslim community perceived the fortunes paid by philanthropists were attempts for personal aggrandizement. The mayor during this time curtailed the rights and privileges enjoyed by Muslims at the Forik Ramat, and that was Cape Times, 3rd of April 1918. And so thousands of Malay and Indian Muslims responded in protest against these restrictions at Sandvlei. Dr. Abdurrahman dissociated himself from the protests against the mayor, the commissioner, and his brother was also involved there, was Dr. I. Abdurrahman, and his cousin, Dr. O. Dolly. They were on that particular committee. Dr. Abdurrahman kept Rahmania under Muslim control entirely because he knew the sentiments of Cape Muslims against non-Muslim participation in Muslim affairs. The funds of £1,000 that were collected for the academy was donated to UCT for a chair for the Eastern philosophy, language, Oriental arts, and science. That is coming from the Union Stock Certificate of number 12192. The compound interest accrued on this amount should be reinvested so that the substantial amount of £20,000 can be reached. And this was in Haji Sulaiman Shah Muhammad's letter to UCT dated the 19th of August 1923. Now, it hasn't done much in terms of development, but I think the fact that that is not an Islamic practice to work with interest is another feature that actually impacts on that particular decision of Haji Shah Muhammad. May Allah forgive them, they had good intentions, but Allah knows best. The academy investment could facilitate the qualifications of 2 qualified Muslim teachers that could be employed into the Muslim primary schools in the Cape. Even though if the benefactor did not explicitly express each intent. Page 242 of the original Ajam thesis. On the other hand, Dr. Abdurrahman's success of the establishment of Rahmania caused others to approach Dr. Abdurrahman for assistance. The Claremont Muslim community, which ushered in the establishment of Tal Falah Primary School, was one such establishment. We just call it Tal Falah Primary School. In 1912, a building on the corner of Hemlock and Draper Street was purchased for Islamic instructions of boys and girls. It started as a large traditional madrasa known as Madrasatul Falah, the School of Success, often intended to teach Muslims the basic philosophies and practical aspects of Islamic belief. They called it Tal Falah. It was a large madrasa and the Claremont Muslim Education Society appointed 2 Islamic instructors who both studied in Mecca, Imam Abdul Rauf and Imam Abdurrahman Siddiq. The 2 imams could not depend on fixed salary. Fees were collected from a close-knit group. Imam Siddiq started negotiating with Dr. Abdurrahman as a counselor to effectively work towards changing Tal Falah from a madrasa to a Muslim mission school in order to receive state aid. Tal Falah was converted into a state-aided school in 1916. Bazaars were organized to finance the extension of the school building. Dr. Abdurrahman could not attend the bazaar, but he sent a letter of support and some articles for sale to the bazaar. Dr. Abdurrahman secured state aid for the Tal Falah Arabic teacher, and Dr. Abdurrahman, as manager of the school, appointed the young Mr. Moses Tachi Bihadin as the principal of Tal Falah in the latter part of 1916. Later, Dr. Abdurrahman transferred him to Rahmania, and a more experienced Christian principal, Mr. Curry, was appointed as principal of Tal Falah. The doctor in this way demonstrated his belief that the best man deserves the job, regardless of religious belief. Few Muslims at the time qualified for both principal posts at the 2 state-aided Muslim schools. The establishment of 2 schools under the management of Dr. Abdurrahman was an inspiration to others equally concerned with the lack of schooling for their children and who were eager to do something about it. We're now going to on page 50, which is the Salt River Muslim School. At the moment, the Salt River Muslim School was closed by the Western Cape government on the premise that there's no funding and it's not conducive to education, although all those things were in actual fact contested. But they closed the school. So let's listen to the history of the Salt River Muslim School. A rapidly growing Muslim community in Salt River, Woodstock area required a valiant effort of its own. The local Muslim artisans and Indian traders provided the required skills and finance to start the school from a small room in Kingsley Road in Salt River. The names of Haji Abdullah Adams, Ibrahim Martin, Buni Samarun, Khafildin Mali, and Luther, as well as Messieurs Bardin and Jafar, are mentioned for their valiant effort in establishing the school. This is from Brandt's research, 1966, Solidarity Patterns in Minority Groups, a study of the Indian community of the Cape Peninsula. It's an MA thesis, University of Stellenbosch. Modernization stimulated the establishment of Islam-oriented schools. Haji Ibrahim Noruddin, an esteemed merchant and who served on Dr. Abdurrahman's Education League's committee, was elected as the first manager of Salt River Muslim School. He called leading merchants and some friends together and collected £1,000 in one afternoon, and it's quoted as an enormous sum of money for that time, 1916. Artisans and laborers of Salt River volunteered their skills. This is a beautiful part of the Cape, of the Muslims of the Cape. They, in the 1800s, most of them built mosques and schools out of sheer voluntary labor. Every weekend they would build and not take a cent in their particular effort to serve the Muslims as a ibadah, as a work, a good work that they wish to present to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as God, as an acceptable work of them for the future, even after their death. So that was one of the most beautiful things of the Cape Muslims. The school constituted, the school's constitution stipulated that the school building should remain the property of Muslims. The trustees shall be equally represented by Afrikaans and Indian Muslims. This is now Malays and Indian Muslims, the difference between Malays who speak Kaps and Indians who they spoke their own language at the time, and English, obviously. So there was that kind of stipulated feature in the Salt River Muslim School Constitution, and the school's constitution stipulated that the school building shall remain the property of Muslims, and the trustees shall be equally represented by Afrikaans and Indian Muslims. And all Muslims shall be entitled to governing body officialdom. The combined efforts in Salt River resulted in its school being erected entirely from their own resources. Very interesting. Rahmania had some white people that also contributed and to the establishment and the building and the establishment of Rahmania. Here, this particular school, Salt River, is entirely on their own resources. Thus giving the Salt River Muslim Primary School the special status of a waqf, an unalienable property, trust property of all Muslims, stopping any one single person from claiming personal ownership. and stopping transfer of any such property to any particular person or body. It must be mentioned, even if no Arabic name of one associate, even if no Arabic name or one associate with Islamic culture was given to the school. Oh, okay. It must be maintained. Let's say, no, wait. All the contributors stipulated that the Islamic ethos of the school must be maintained, even if no Arabic name or one associated with Islamic culture was given to the school. Page 257 of the thesis. The last two paragraphs of the school's constitution impose a restriction and requirements for the use of the building. No un-Islamic activities after school, dancing, etc. And children must be taught the unity of God, Tawheed, the life of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu, and must make their 5 daily prayers. Quote, modernization of education shall not be at the expense of what were perceived to be eternal and universally valid, unquote. This came from the minds of Muslims of Salt River, who were mostly unschooled and basically literate, but upright in Islamic values. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, Cape Town had 3 Muslim primary schools that received state aid. Each functioned independently of each other. Okay, that's very interesting. So we now come to problems for Islam-oriented schools. Page number 51. The following problems were soon encountered at the Muslim primary schools. Continuous expansion. Some children that applied were 12 years old and had no schooling. Muslim children from Muslim state-aided schools were not later accepted at Christian schools. So that kind of prejudice was also practiced. This was hoped would isolate Muslim children who did not attend the existing church missionary schools. Irrespective of these barriers, the Muslim mission schools that were state-aided were growing and functioning. Dr. Abdurrahman gave Muslims an alternative schooling other than the existing Christian missionary schools. The state funding that Dr. Abdurrahman managed to secure for Muslim schools was his brilliance to point out that the policy related to state funding of mission schools did not stipulate which type of missionary school, so that he could argue that Muslim missionary schools should then also receive state funding. He thus managed, through the truism of the Muslim elite and the free craftsmanship of Muslims, to play a crucial role in allowing Muslim communities the opportunity to become economically modernized. This also helped the indigent Muslims from gaining access to education through the help of the affluent and the doctor's guidance and supervision. Comparing Dr. Abdurrahman's contribution with that of Haji Sulaiman Shah Muhammad, it becomes clear that the doctor was more successful than the more affluent but politically guileless Haji. This is quoted from the work of Dr. Ajam. Before Dr. Abdurrahman, Cape Muslims regarded the education of their children as an exclusive religious affair. The doctor did not only establish state-aided Muslim primary schools, he also used his position and skills to marshal the demands for non-sectarian high school for colored people in Cape Town. By establishing the first Muslim primary school, Dr. Abdurrahman was simultaneously making a political and religious statement that emboldened others to do likewise. Since 1920, the trend towards establishing Muslim mission schools proceeded with greater enthusiasm. Imperceptibly, the education of Muslim children was taken from the hands of the traditional madrasa teacher and was incrementally being secularized. Founding of Islam-oriented schools from 1921 to 1940. This period sees Muslim schools quadrupled as a direct result of the precedent set by Dr. Abdurrahman. Muslim primary schools were established in District 6 in Claremont, in Salt River. Each constituted an effort at modernizing the instruction and socialization of Muslim children in a synthesis of the Islamic and Western curriculum. Founding such schools was at the same time a strategy of survival of the Muslim cultural heritage. The 1920s saw the establishment of 8 more Muslim primary schools. Paarl and Simonstown, 1923, Worcester, 1928, Wynberg and Strand, 1929, Muir Street and Scottish Grove, 1930, and Freire Street, 1938. And one must remember these schools were built by our people, free, voluntary work, sadaqah work every weekend. They built these schools. And, after that, I don't think any of us has basically built any schools because we became academics and not craftsmen anymore. And the only other school that was built, and not by South African funding or by locally Muslims, but by international funding, was Islamia that was built with foreign funding and also people of the rich people of the community. But it was paid labor that actually built the place. So the Muslim schools that were built in the 1800s and the 1920s, etc., were purely by voluntary work of people, and was quite a what can I say? It's an achievement. I'm sure maybe in the 20s they started paying people some salaries in order to build, but the first mosques, etc., and schools were built were freely by people, by the Muslims, by the Cape Muslim artisans. Their influence, these schools asserted an Islamic group identity. It built on institutional changes that took place in the preceding decade. They influenced the changing of the Muslim society of the time because these schools reflected both an authentic Islamic and modern social structure. It aimed at being socially useful and economically desirable. Dr. Abdurrahman was the most prominent figure in the extension of the Muslim mission schools across the Cape. Others emulated his initiative. He helped them where possible, even when other urgent political issues demanded his time. His divided attention, caused by the political categorization of Indian, colored, and Malay, resulted in the Malays claiming that he neglected his own people. This was a core reason for the establishment of the Cape Malay Association. Now, there's the kind of politics that started affecting the Muslim community. Cape Town's many religious communities found themselves part of a new political dispensation as citizens of the Union of South Africa. There was effective exclusion of the politically disabled by white supremacy advocates. In the council where the disenfranchised still had Dr. Abdurrahman, they gave him their support and expected his support. He voiced their concerns on public platforms and in the corridors of power, particularly when the educational defects and desires were discussed. The traditional client-patron relationship were at an end. The negotiations between imams and officialdom no longer held sway. Ethnic considerations, immigrants, and the indigenous Muslims were becoming increasingly irrelevant. Dr. Abdurrahman believed that it was through education that colored people would be able to improve their economic and social condition. Dr. Abdurrahman's concerns were published in the Cape Times on the 22nd of March 1921 and summarized as follows. The South African public does not grasp the extent of its educational problem. The mission school period had ended, and the colored people could no longer be regarded as mere clients and dependents on white people. The colored people were also entering the intricacies and intimacies of the economic life of the Europeans. He suggested that more money should be allocated for non-white education because this would ensure that more schools were available to prepare a more productive citizenry. The thrust of his message was that provision of schools must keep pace with economic trends and demand because of the growing needs for goods and services and a more skilled workforce. He mentioned that the prospects of consumerism were limited by restrictive educational policies. That's a very important point here. People don't realize that education actually hampers the development of a country and not improves it, improve it. The educational dispensation made the colored part of the social machinery move at a slower pace. It was the APO, the African People Organization, the Cape Malay Association, and the local Muslim Association outside Cape Town who tried to adjust the rate of progress in the politically white-dominated Cape Colony. Wherever Muslims settled, they established mosques for worship and cultural reproduction. But they were drawn into the mainstream culture where their inadequacies were keenly felt in the job market. Leading figures in the administration of the mosque were especially alive to the optimal use of their cultural facilities. They looked with interest at model schools with which Dr. Abdurrahman was associated. The Simonstown Muslim Community School. Page 53. This small indigent community of artisans, craftsmen, tailors, fishermen, laborers, and freed slaves used a small room as their place of worship and for the traditional Islamic school. They were relatively isolated from the larger Cape. They were the major builders of the Simonstown Harbour. In 1876, they converted the small room into a mosque. In 1925, the mosque was extended and it included facilities for a school. Dr. Abdurrahman sent a letter of appeal for funds and assistance to Mr. Abdul Aziz in 1940. He received a positive response. In 1920, the Anglican Church Mission School, St. Francis, claimed that there were no accommodation for the expelled Muslim children. The Imam and the congregation felt that the Muslims of Simonstown should establish their own school attached to the mosque. I'm going to have to stop there. It's Maghrib. Inshallah, we'll continue. We're on page 53 on the Simonstown Muslim School Community. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shukran.